It was a busy afternoon at the bustling downtown bank. The line stretched almost to the door, and customers murmured their frustrations while impatiently glancing at their watches. At the far end of the line stood Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman clutching a worn leather purse. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a faded envelope, her eyes scanning the room for a friendly face. No one seemed to notice her, and those who did gave dismissive looks as if her presence was an inconvenience. She took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage to step forward. When it was finally her turn, she approached the counter with hesitant steps. The young teller, Brittany, barely looked up from her screen. "Next!" she snapped, her voice cold and detached. Mrs. Thompson forced a polite smile and placed the envelope on the counter. "Good afternoon," she said softly. "I'm here because I've been charged fees that I don't understand. I brought all my documents to see if you could help me figure it out." Brittany snatched the envelope without a word, flipping through the papers with an air of annoyance. "These charges are standard," she said flatly, shoving the documents back. "You probably didn't read the fine print." Mrs. Thompson's face fell, and she swallowed hard, trying not to show how much it hurt to be spoken to like that. "But I've been banking here for over 20 years. I've never had fees like this before." Brittany rolled her eyes. "Well, maybe it's time you kept a higher balance, ma'am. That's how it works now." A few nearby customers glanced over, some snickering under their breath. Mrs. Thompson's cheeks flushed, and she tried to explain, but her voice came out shaky and weak. "I just want to understand. I live on a fixed income, and this mistake—" Before she could finish, the branch manager, Todd, appeared behind the counter, his stern expression making Brittany straighten up immediately. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, glaring at Mrs. Thompson as if she were the cause of the disturbance. Brittany shot the elderly woman a smug glance before replying, "Just a customer who doesn't understand basic fees." Todd folded his arms and looked Mrs. Thompson up and down, a hint of disdain in his eyes. "If you can't manage your account properly, maybe you should consider banking elsewhere," he said bluntly. A heavy silence fell, and Mrs. Thompson's heart sank as she realized no one was going to help her. Just as she lowered her gaze to the floor, holding back tears, a calm but firm voice cut through the tension. "Is that how you treat loyal customers around here?" The entire room froze, heads turning in unison to the man who had spoken. He stood near the entrance, dressed in a simple black jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. There was something about his presence, an effortless authority that made everyone fall silent. Todd raised an eyebrow, sizing up the stranger with irritation. "And who are you to interfere?" he challenged, his voice laced with arrogance. The man took a few casual steps forward, pulling off his cap and revealing a familiar face. Gasps echoed through the room as recognition dawned on everyone. It was Keanu Reeves, calm and composed, his gaze fixed firmly on Todd. Todd's smug expression faltered, and Brittany's face went pale as whispers swept through the crowd. "Keanu Reeves, here." A few people fumbled with their phones, trying to snap a picture without being too obvious. Keanu didn't acknowledge the murmurs or the eyes on him. His attention remained fixed on Todd. With a quiet confidence, Keanu stepped closer to the counter, giving Mrs. Thompson a reassuring nod. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said calmly. "It sounded like this lady just wanted a little help understanding her account." Todd cleared his throat, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Reeves, I didn't realize. He hesitated, clearly rattled, but forced a polite smile. "This is just a small issue. Nothing to worry about." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Nothing to worry about? From where I'm standing, it looks like you're dismissing her concerns without even listening." His voice remained calm, but there was a subtle edge to his words that made Todd shift uncomfortably. Brittany, still visibly shaken, chimed in, trying to deflect. "It's just standard procedure, sir. These charges are automatic, and there's really nothing we can do." Keanu's eyes didn't leave Todd. Automatic, huh? Funny how these automatic fees seem to target the elderly. People who've been loyal customers for decades. Makes me wonder if that's really just a coincidence. Todd forced a laugh, trying to keep his composure. Of course it's a coincidence. We don't discriminate against anyone. If she's having trouble keeping up with account maintenance, that's her responsibility. Keanu's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained calm. Responsibility. You mean the responsibility of understanding hidden fees buried in fine print? Or is it your responsibility to make sure your customers aren't being taken advantage of? Silence fell over the room again, and a few customers nodded in agreement. Todd looked around, clearly losing control of the narrative. Sensing weakness, Keanu stepped closer, lowering his voice but making every word resonate. "You know," he said softly, "respect doesn't cost anything. But charging someone who's barely making it, without explaining why, that's not just unkind, it's unethical." Todd swallowed hard, trying to hide his discomfort. "Mr. Reeves, I assure you." Keanu cut him off, his tone firm but never raised. "Assure me?" "No, assure her. Apologize and fix this, right now." Brittany looked like she wanted to disappear, and Todd was visibly sweating. Mrs. Thompson, still in shock, couldn't help but stare at Keanu, wondering how someone so famous could be so compassionate. The tension hung in the air, and everyone waited to see what Todd would do next. Todd hesitated, his gaze darting around the room, desperate to find some way out of this humiliating situation. Customers were still whispering, some even filming with their phones. Brittany looked at him for guidance, but he was too rattled to respond. Keanu kept his calm, unwavering stare on Todd, his presence radiating quiet authority. Reluctantly, Todd cleared his throat and forced a tight smile. "Of course, Mr. Reeves. We value all our customers, and I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Brittany, take another look at her account and make sure everything's in order." Brittany hurried to pull up the details on her computer, her hands trembling as she typed. Keanu glanced back at Mrs. Thompson and offered a reassuring smile. "Don't worry," he said gently. "We'll get this sorted out." As Brittany scanned the account, her face paled even further. She hesitated, glancing nervously at Todd. Sir?" she whispered. "There's something strange here. The maintenance fees. They tripled in the last few months without any apparent reason." Keanu's eyes narrowed. "Tripled? Why would that happen?" Todd stammered, clearly caught off guard. I'm sure it's just a glitch. These systems can be unpredictable sometimes." Keanu didn't buy it. He leaned in slightly, keeping his voice steady but piercing. "A glitch that just so happens to target an elderly customer? Doesn't sound like a coincidence to me. Maybe it's time someone took a closer look at how you're running things here." The pressure mounted, and Todd tried to recover. I'll look into it personally, Mr. Reeves. We'll fix the issue and make sure she's compensated." Keanu nodded slowly, but didn't move. Fixing this one case isn't enough. If this happened to her, how many others are facing the same issue? Brittany bit her lip, glancing at the screen. "Actually, it looks like there are several accounts with similar charges, mostly belonging to elderly customers. It's not just her." Todd's face went pale, and sweat glistened on his forehead. Keanu gave him a long, hard look. "You know," he said calmly, "mistakes can happen. But patterns like this? That's more than just a mistake. That's deliberate. I think the authorities might be interested to know how this bank has been managing its accounts." Todd's hands trembled as he struggled to respond. "There's no need for that. I'll make sure every affected account is reviewed and reimbursed. Personally." Keanu didn't break eye contact, his presence unwavering. "And you'll make sure it doesn't happen again? Not to her, not to anyone." "Yes, absolutely," Todd blurted out, eager to end the confrontation. Keanu gave a small nod, as if satisfied but still wary. Mrs. Thompson glanced at Keanu, her eyes welling up with gratitude. Keanu put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did nothing wrong," he said softly. "Don't let anyone make you feel small." For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Thompson smiled. A fragile, grateful smile that held a world of relief. The tension in the room finally eased, but Todd knew this wasn't over. Keanu had exposed more than just an accounting mistake. He'd revealed a systemic problem that couldn't be swept under the rug. Todd's mind raced, trying to calculate the damage. The customers who had been quietly watching now looked at him with suspicion and disdain. He knew the situation was spiraling out of control, and Keanu's unwavering stare only made it worse. Desperate to save face, Todd straightened his tie and forced a smile. "Mr. Reeves," he began, his voice shaky, "I assure you, we take these matters very seriously. I'll personally oversee a thorough investigation to make sure every affected account is corrected." Keanu didn't blink, his gaze steady and unyielding. "That's a start," he replied calmly. "But I have a feeling this goes deeper than just a few accounts. How long have these charges been going on?" Brittany hesitated, glancing between Todd and Keanu, unsure whether to speak up. Seeing her hesitation, Keanu softened his tone. "You don't have to cover for anyone," he said gently. "Just tell the truth." She swallowed hard and pulled up more records on her screen, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through countless transactions. "It's been happening for at least 6 months," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Almost exclusively to elderly customers." A wave of anger flashed across Keanu's face, though he remained composed. 6 months? And no one thought to question why so many seniors were being charged triple fees? Todd quickly interjected, trying to regain control. "It must be an error in the system. We recently upgraded our software, and it's possible the settings." "Stop lying," Keanu cut in firmly. The room went silent again, tension hanging heavy in the air. "Errors don't just target specific groups of people. You knew about this, didn't you?" Todd hesitated, the truth teetering on his lips, but he couldn't admit fault. I didn't know it was this widespread," he finally muttered. Keanu shook his head slowly, disappointed but unsurprised. "You didn't bother to check because it didn't affect your bottom line. Profiting off vulnerable people? That's not just unethical, it's criminal." The customers in the bank started murmuring among themselves, their frustration growing as the truth sank in. An elderly man near the door spoke up, his voice filled with outrage. "I've been getting those fees too. Thought it was just me not keeping up with the new policies." A younger woman nodded in agreement. "My grandmother mentioned the same thing. She's been struggling to keep up with the sudden charges." Todd's face turned beet red, realizing the situation was completely out of his hands now. Brittany bit her lip, clearly regretting her involvement. Keanu turned to the crowd, his voice calm yet commanding. "Anyone else affected by these charges, step forward. Don't stay silent about it. You have the right to be heard." One by one, people moved closer, their stories overlapping. Unexpected fees, unexplained deductions, and helplessness in the face of cold, dismissive staff. Todd looked overwhelmed, his reputation crumbling before his eyes. Keanu nodded at the group, reassuring them with a quiet strength. "We're not going to let this go unanswered," he promised. "Justice isn't just a word, it's an action." Todd knew there was no escaping the consequences now, and the weight of his choices settled on his shoulders like a crushing burden. Keanu wasn't just defending one woman. He was exposing an entire corrupt practice. Todd's knees felt weak as the gravity of the situation hit him. The crowd was growing restless, murmuring angrily as more and more people came forward, sharing similar stories of unfair charges. Brittany glanced nervously at Todd, but he was too stunned to give any direction. Keanu remained calm, but his intense gaze didn't waver. Finally, Todd cleared his throat, trying to sound authoritative despite his shaky voice. "Everyone, please calm down. We will address these issues properly. I assure you, the bank takes customer satisfaction very seriously." Keanu crossed his arms, unimpressed. "Is that why you humiliated Mrs. Thompson instead of listening to her? You seemed pretty satisfied dismissing her concerns just a minute ago." A few customers chuckled bitterly, and Todd's face burned with shame. He knew his excuses wouldn't hold up anymore. Desperately, he looked at Brittany. "Pull up all the affected accounts," he ordered, trying to sound in control. "We'll start reversing the charges immediately." Brittany nodded quickly and began typing, but the screen kept freezing, overwhelmed by the number of flagged accounts. Todd's frustration grew as he realized the sheer scale of the problem. Keanu took out his phone and started recording the scene, focusing on Todd. "You're admitting that elderly customers were wrongfully charged excessive fees for months?" Keanu asked, his voice calm but demanding accountability. Todd hesitated, but with dozens of phones pointed at him and Keanu's piercing gaze fixed on his, he had no choice. "Yes," he mumbled. "It seems there was a mistake in the system." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "A mistake that only targeted elderly people? That's not a system error. That's targeted exploitation. You need to own up to it." Feeling cornered, Todd glanced around at the angry faces staring back at him. He knew there was no escaping this now. We will conduct a full internal investigation," he stammered. "And anyone affected will be fully reimbursed." Keanu didn't lower his phone, still recording. "And what about you? Who authorized these changes? Who decided that seniors would bear the brunt of these so-called system errors?" Todd's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air, unable to form a coherent answer. Just then, a voice from the back spoke up, a man in a suit who had been watching silently until now. He stepped forward, his ID badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "I'm Michael Sanders, the regional manager," he announced, giving Todd a withering glare. "I've been monitoring the situation, and I assure you, this behavior does not align with our bank's policies or values." Todd looked horrified as Michael turned to Keanu, his tone respectful. "Mr. Reeves, I deeply apologize for what you and these customers have witnessed. I will personally ensure that all affected accounts are reviewed and corrected. This level of negligence is unacceptable." Keanu lowered his phone slightly, his tone still firm. "Negligence or deliberate exploitation? Make sure you find out which it is." Michael nodded. "Absolutely. I'll see to it that this matter is thoroughly investigated, and any responsible parties will be held accountable. Thank you for bringing this to our attention." Keanu gave a slight nod, satisfied that some accountability was finally happening. He looked back at Mrs. Thompson, who was still clutching her envelope with tears in her eyes. "You did good," he said softly. "You spoke up, and that's what made the difference." The crowd murmured in agreement, their frustration slowly easing now that real action was being promised. But Keanu knew it wasn't over yet. He'd just exposed the surface of something much darker lurking within the system. As the tension began to ease, Michael gestured for Todd and Brittany to follow him into the back office. But Keanu wasn't done yet. He stepped forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "One more thing," he said, making them pause. "I want transparency. The public deserves to know how this happened and who's responsible. No sweeping it under the rug." Michael hesitated, glancing at the crowd still filming and whispering among themselves. He gave a reluctant nod. "You're right, Mr. Reeves. We'll make a public statement and ensure all affected customers are contacted directly. I'll personally oversee it." Keanu gave him a long, piercing look before finally nodding. Satisfied that the matter was being taken seriously, he turned to Mrs. Thompson and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Let's get you out of here," he whispered kindly. She gave him a trembling smile, still overwhelmed by everything that had unfolded. As they moved toward the exit, the crowd parted to let them through, some people whispering words of gratitude to Keanu for standing up to the bank. Outside, the afternoon sun bathed the street in golden light, and Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, her spirit feeling lighter than it had in months. She looked up at Keanu, her eyes welling with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to do any of that. I was just nobody." Keanu smiled gently, his gaze softening. "You're not nobody," he replied. "You're someone who deserves respect and fairness, just like anyone else. Don't ever let people make you feel small." Tears spilled from Mrs. Thompson's eyes as she nodded, touched beyond words. "You're a good man," she whispered. "The world needs more like you." Keanu gave her a humble smile. "The world needs more people like you, strong enough to stand up even when it's hard. Take care of yourself, okay?" Mrs. Thompson nodded, watching as Keanu gave her one last reassuring nod before walking away. As he moved down the sidewalk, people who had gathered outside the bank clapped and cheered, grateful for his courage and integrity. Keanu waved lightly, not wanting the attention, but understanding that people needed hope. Later that evening, news of the incident spread like wildfire. Videos of Keanu confronting Todd went viral, with millions of views and countless comments praising his bravery and compassion. The bank issued a formal apology, promising a full investigation and compensation for every affected customer. Todd and Brittany were both suspended pending further action, and Michael Sanders made a public commitment to changing the bank's policies to prevent such exploitation in the future. But it wasn't just about fixing the mistake. It was about restoring faith. People were inspired, not just by Keanu's actions, but by his unwavering commitment to doing what was right, no matter the cost. A few days later, Mrs. Thompson received a call from the bank, apologizing and confirming that all her fees had been refunded. She couldn't help but smile, knowing that justice had prevailed. As she sat by her window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude, not just for the refund, but for the kindness of a stranger who saw her as more than just a number. Keanu Reeves didn't just change her day, he changed her life, reminding her and everyone else that one voice can make a difference when it refuses to be silenced.